here.
Oh, I want to sit there.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I do.
You like George Costanza. I like Governor George Costanza. Birthday party. All right. Okay. So chapter 31 in your text. Chapter 31 in the textbook is the Great Forgotten Chapter. That was the chapter that you were supposed to read for the essay that you were writing, which kind of gave me the impression that maybe people didn't read that entirely. So there are about 9 questions out of that chapter. The first one deals with the Red Scare of the 1920s. Now, in 4th and in 6th period today, we talked about the Red Scare. In the 3rd period, the Civil War stuff. But in 4th and 6th, we talked about the Red Scare, right? And we talked about kind of Nixon and, you know, Truman's loyalty boards and, you know, the loyalty examinations that Truman did, and eventually Joe McCarthy. And what we said was there was a kind of a hysterical fear that there was internal subversion, that there was communists that were infiltrating every level of society, and that this was a threat to the safety and security of the United States. The Red Scare of the 1950s that we talked about today was the second Red Scare in American history.
Mr. Evans, please call 5742. Mr. Evans, please call 5742.
The first Red Scare was 1919 through 1921. And so the first Red Scare was the Red Scare of the 1920s and was a part of this whole cultural conflict that we talked about being in that era. The first Red Scare was a response to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. You know, up until 1917, there had not been a communist state in the world. The Bolsheviks, Soviets, you know, Russian communists took over, created the Soviet Union, and you had, for the first time, a legitimate communist nation, a powerful legitimate communist nation. This terrified people. And, you know, this notion of Bolshevism and communism in the aftermath of the war, World War I we're talking about, created a kind of hysteria in the United States. Also, in the aftermath of the war, there was a rash of labor disputes. There were these bombings. And this generated a fear that communism, that communist kind of insurgents were attempting to violently overthrow the United States government. That was the first Red Scare. The first Red Scare is that communists were plotting to violently overthrow the United States government. And the then Attorney General, anybody remember? Oh, you wouldn't remember. But anybody remember reading his name? And this guy became, I don't want to say he's the McCarthy of the first Red Scare, but he's kind of the central name associated with it. He was Wilson's Attorney General. He basically exploited the Red Scare. He said, look, don't worry, I'll protect you. I'll round up these dangerous radicals. I'll arrest them. I'll deport them back to the Soviet Union. Anybody remember? Go ahead, Dylan.
Palmer?
Yeah, how about that? Mitchell Palmer. Mitchell Palmer. We called it the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids were January 1st, 1920. We rounded up all these suspected subversives. And they found like a grand total of like 1 gun or something like that, you know, when this happened. And so we talk about the Palmer Raids as part of that first Red Scare. We also talk about, in chapter 31, when we talk about this sort of cultural conflict, you know, these dangerous ideas coming into the country. And one of these dangerous ideas is communism. Another, you know, other dangerous ideas involve religion, you know, kind of the secularism. Other dangerous ideas involve kind of the role of women, the flapper. Everybody wrote about that on their papers. But one of the greatest manifestation of kind of a fear of this change is the Ku Klux Klan. Now you can be sure that the revitalized Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s will be on the test tomorrow. The revitalized Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, we say the revitalized Ku Klux Klan because the first Ku Klux Klan was a response to radical Reconstruction. Since we are kind of reviewing in general for this test and for the AP test, you know, let's go back to that just really quickly. I promise, Billy, just quickly. You know, radical Reconstruction was that attempt to kind of, you know, reconstruct the South in a manner in the aftermath of the Civil War that would be supportive of the Republican Party, which involved the enfranchisement and the social equality of former slaves. And remember, the white South responds to what they consider to be oppression, by Republicans with creating the Ku Klux Klan, a vigilante organization that was intended on overthrowing the Republican regimes. Do you remember when we talked about radical Reconstruction? We said there were three groups of people that made up those Republican regimes, and I know this is way outside of the wheelhouse, but go ahead, Burns.
Scallywags.
Thanks, George.
Not that's it. Scallywags, carpetbaggers, and the freedmen, right? And they had their regimes that they controlled in the South. And the Ku Klux Klan, the first Ku Klux Klan, was an attempt to overthrow this. And they were successful. They did it. In 1877, they were successful in overturning all the Democratic regimes, or all the Republican regimes in the South, and replacing them with Democratic regimes. And after that, the first Ku Klux Klan faded. It just faded from existence. It didn't need to exist anymore. They had accomplished their objectives. It is reinvigorated in 1915 and explodes in the 1920s, where its membership soared. Why? Well, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was a response to what we call old America, traditional America, saw as all of these changes. Radical ideas, communists, all kind of foreigners coming in, the movement of African Americans out of the South. The Ku Klux Klan is a response to that. And remember, in your textbook, when you read about the Klan, when you wrote about the Klan, the size, the scope of the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was terrifying. They marched in the streets of Washington, D.C. And so it was a reaction, to some extent, to what kind of changes were occurring. We talked a little bit about that. We also said, that immigration, I didn't say this was in your book, that immigration restrictions were also a reaction to what people saw as changes in society. Here come all these immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. We've got to stop this before everything spins out of control. Half of them are communists, they're this, radical ideas, Sacco and Vanzetti. So for the first time in American history, in 1921 and in 1924, you had restrictions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern, or from Europe in general. And remember, well, I don't remember if you talked about this because you never read about it, those immigration restrictions, particularly the 1924 legislation, discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans, who were thought to be less, kind of culturally and actually racially, even though they're not racist, capable. Now, the biggest, maybe, and most dangerous idea that pervaded the 1920s traditional thinking was that of evolution. And you really, really, really need to know about the Scopes trial. It's something we didn't talk about in class. It's something a lot of you read about. But the Scopes trial was basically this. John T. Scopes was a biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, who illegally taught evolution to his class. It was against the law in Tennessee to teach Darwin's theory of evolution. Scopes purposely violated that law to test it. He was tried. What happened to him? He was tried. Was he convicted?
Yeah, he got like a fine.
Yes. He was tried and convicted and fined $100. But the trial, which was called the monkey trial, right? The trial in Dayton, Tennessee, is the real kind of embodiment of the cultural conflict. On one side, you have fundamentalist religion. And who was the kind of head of that one side? He was Bryan, yes.
Right.
Yeah, William Jennings Bryan, came in to assist the prosecution. Well, he wasn't from Tennessee. He was just this, three-time presidential loser who was kind of the symbol of rural old America, that was brought in, that came in to assist. And then who defended Scopes? What was the lead attorney? Does anybody remember? Yeah. Clarence Darrow. And then the dramatic conclusion of the trial was when Darrow put Bryan on the stand as an expert witness for Christianity. And then, Darrow, I guess, embarrassed Bryan, depending upon your perspective. And Bryan, ate himself to death afterwards. He had a problem with, gluttony. And he would eat, huge amounts of, food. And I guess after this trial, like ate all these pancakes. And I mean, I don't want to oversimplify. It's kind of sad. He like ate himself to death. You know. I mean,
What a way to go.
But the Scopes trial is important.
Death
You
by
should have a
pancakes.
familiarity with that. Also, I mentioned, on the test, a novel that was written in the 1920s that embodied the importance of business and money during the time. It was written by Bruce Barton. It was entitled The Man Nobody Knows. I actually did mention this in class. What was the subject of that novel? Does anybody besides the instructor remember? Yeah, go ahead, J.R.
That like Jesus was the best advertisement.
Yes, that Jesus was the best advertising and businessman of the time period. And so this stresses how important material possessions business was during the time period. We said, the cultural conflict certainly defines the 1920s. There goes Mandela.
That was good.
You're not gonna get it?
Somebody, Mr. Vigo is going to enjoy that eventually. Nina, you saved that piece of art. She eyeballed him silently. All right, now. So anyways, we talked about the prosperity of the 1920s, and we gave you a number of reasons for the prosperity of the 1920s. The two that I'd like to stress, reasons why the economy prospered in the 1920s. One was the automobile. And I asked you a couple of questions about the automobile on the examination. I talk about the growth of the auto industry, the importance of the car, how building automobiles and all the things associated with having a society that's based on the car generated a whole lot of economic activity. I also asked you on the test about the importance of installment buying on credit. And they clearly talk about this in chapter 31 in your textbook, about how the automobile was significant to the prosperity of the 20s, how material possessions and business was important, and how buying on credit generated financing so that people could buy things like automobiles, radios, other time and labor-saving devices that are going to, improve the standard of living of Americans in this time period and generate a fair amount of economic activity. Another reason for the prosperity of the 1920s, and we listed this as well, was increased productivity. There is a name that we did not talk about in class, but we will mention now, that is associated with productivity, and that is Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor was associated with something called scientific management. Taylorism, it was sometimes called. And what Taylor did is he broke tasks down, and then scientifically business tasks, work tasks down, and then scientifically sort of analyzed them so that they could be conducted in their most efficient manner. And this kind of breaking tasks down is something that Ford did with the assembly line. That generated more productivity and led to lower prices and more output and higher wages for workers at that time. Who was Margaret Sanger? S-A-N-G-E-R, Margaret Sanger. Some of you wrote about her on your papers. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, Sanger was a feminist that advocated birth control. This was really controversial. I mean, feminism, the flapper, the change in the role of women, the automobile, all of these changes that were occurring in the 1920s seemed to be spinning out of control. And when Sanger sort of said, why look, you can prevent childbirth and therefore have kind of relations that aren't associated with that, that was really something that people, didn't like. That represented a challenge to Victorian kind of principles during that time period. Now, that takes us to kind of like 9 questions that are found out in chapter 31 in your text. That's something, look, there are 6 chapters, so 9 is a lot, out of that chapter. So you might want to review that chapter a little bit tonight. After we sort of did that a little bit, you read about that, we spent most of our time talking about the politics of the 1920s. And we went through Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Now, when we talked about Harding, we kind of stressed that Harding, once elected, represented what people wanted, normalcy. And Harding was normal in a number of ways. He was normal in that he kind of represented and embodied small-time America, but he was also normal in that he really wasn't that smart of a guy. So he said that Harding almost admits that he is less than capable of really understanding all the intricacies
Trey Voluntary, report to the office. Trey Voluntary to the office.
of the presidency because he surrounds himself, he argues, with a cabinet that is of top flight. So he said the Harding's problem was that he brought good people in to work in his cabinet, but he also brought other people. Can you name one person in Harding's cabinet? Can you name, we put it up on the board, go ahead, Ann. Charles Evans Hughes was his Secretary of State. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of Treasury. Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce. Albert Fall was the Secretary of Interior, and Fall was a crook, as was Harry Doherty. They were crooks. Also what was the big scandal in the Harding administration? Go ahead.
Teapot Dome.
Teapot Dome. What did that involve? Do you recall?
That Fall tried to have land set aside for the Navy used for his business partners.
Yes, oil reserves. Perfect. Now, Harding dies under maybe mysterious circumstances. We said, who knows? Coolidge takes over. Coolidge cleans up the Harding administration scandals. And so when Coolidge takes over in 23, he cleans up things and he kind of rides a wave of prosperity into the election of 24. Remember, in the election of 24, Coolidge easily beats John Davis to be elected in his own right. But the most significant thing about the election of 24 is that it takes 102 ballots for the Democratic Party to select a candidate. And the division within the party is basically between traditionalists and monarchists, wets and dries. And one of the other things that is true, and you may have read about this in your book, or I'm pretty sure we didn't talk about it, is that the Democratic Party cannot even, or defeats by only one vote, a resolution condemning the claim. In other words, the Democratic Party wants to overtly condemn the claim, but they can't do it. They can't pass a piece of legislation that would overtly condemn the Ku Klux Klan. And so, the Ku Klux Klan is so powerful in 1924 that it influenced the vote in the Democratic Party. Coolidge's administration, we talked a little bit about some of the things, Phillips, that occurred in the Coolidge administration. We talked about Coolidge and Mellon moving to lower taxes. We talked about, higher tariffs. And we said that two pieces of tariff legislation are passed. One is the Ford v. McCumber tariff, and I think that's 22, and that's in the Harding administration. The other piece of tariff legislation that is passed in the 1930s is Smoot-Hawley. The Smoot-Hawley tariff is in Hoover's administration, and it increases tariffs to historic highs. Now, Coolidge, he's the patron saint of business. Hands off, laissez-faire, let it go, low taxes, high tariffs, little regulation, and in his administration, the economy prospered. In 28, we said that Coolidge announced that he would not seek re-election. Herbert Hoover was the natural successor to Coolidge. He had been the Secretary of Commerce in the Harding and the Coolidge administration. He was considered to be sort of an international humanitarian, a philanthropist, someone who had exceptional administrative skills. And remember we said that the one text that we read, what I read and told you about, said that Coolidge was, not Coolidge, Hoover was almost coronated more than elected. That the country was so delighted. Who did he run against? Do you remember? Why was that significant? Hoover runs and he defeats yes. He does not run against FDR in 28. He eventually runs against FDR. But in 28, who does he run against? He runs against Al Smith. And Al Smith's claim to fame, he's the first major presidential candidate who is Catholic. So remember, old America is Protestant. Now here comes Al Smith, who he said was Catholic, urban, wet, child of Irish immigrants. Everything that old America was afraid of was Al Smith. And Al Smith runs against Hoover. Hoover crushes him in the election of 28, riding the tide of prosperity. Hoover sweeps into office, and we said it's not 6 months before the stock market crashes and the Great Depression is ushered in. We gave a number of reasons for the Great Depression, and we did say this. We said, look, there's not a consensus. It's not like policymakers and historians agree on what caused the Great Depression. We said there are some causes that are frequently mentioned. An imbalance in international trade that was perpetrated by the Smoot-Hawley tariff. An unequal distribution in income that may have been promoted by the tax policies of the Republicans in the 1920s. You know, these are things that are associated with the Depression. A weak banking structure, you know, being something else that's associated with the reasons for the Great Depression. You know, certainly oversupply, under demand, all of these things. There's not necessarily a consensus. But eventually, Hoover finds himself the president at a time where unemployment begins to climb rapidly, despair occurs, and we talked about kind of the dilemma of Herbert Hoover. And what we said was that although Hoover is widely considered to have done very little to address the problems of the Great Depression, that he did more than any other president had ever done to address an economic calamity. Now, we said that one thing, one government agency is always associated with Hoover's response to the Depression. Does anyone besides the instructor remember? Go ahead, J.R. Oh, it would be the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And remember, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation absolutely, positively embodies Hoover's philosophy about dealing with the Great Depression. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation loaned money to big banks and businesses to keep them afloat during these hard times. The idea being if banks and businesses stayed in business, they would employ workers, keep people on the job, and this would allow the economy to survive until it would naturally recover. Now, we said the reason this embodies Hoover is what Hoover refused to do. What he would not do in addressing the Great Depression is the direct goal. Hoover refused handouts. I will not have the national government hand money to hungry people. Now, because Hoover was perceived as being indifferent to people suffering, you know, he was fairly unpopular. Remember, we talked about Hoover really not having a political personality, not being a warm person to begin with, desperately trying to address the problems of the Depression, but having a line that he would not cross. And then we said one event in the summer of '32 really causes people to be disgruntled with Hoover, and that is his response to the bonus army. Who were the bonus marchers still?
They marched.
For the bonus. Yeah. All right, yes, go ahead.
The war veterans who wanted their wartime bonus.
Oh, so you are saying, Mandela, they were veterans of World War I that had been promised a bonus that they wanted to pay to them early, and that they marched in mass to Washington, D.C., camped at the Anacostia Flats, and there they sat and petitioned Congress for this bonus, and Congress said no.
Exactly.
Right? And then many of them went home, but some lingered, and eventually Hoover ordered, guess who led that? I mentioned this guy today, Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, the same guy that Truman canned today, he's the person that led the attack on the bonus army. So Hoover told MacArthur to chase these, incidentally, FDR is going to say at one point that Huey Long was one of the two most dangerous men in America. The other was Douglas MacArthur. Right? So Douglas MacArthur, 3 times we've got Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was ordered to chase the bonus army marchers out of Washington. One of Douglas MacArthur's aides was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Right? So their first military activity was chasing their own civilian population out of D.C., which they did with overzeal, which embarrasses Hoover and discredits him. So in 32, when Hoover is running for re-election, he doesn't have much of a chance. The economy, unemployment was reaching 20%. The economy was in, the doldrums. And so it's not surprising that Franklin Roosevelt, who promised the American people a New Deal when he was nominated by the Democratic Party, would be easily elected like he was. Now, as far as Roosevelt's presidency, when we talked about Roosevelt's presidency, we divided it into two parts, the first and the second New Deal. The first New Deal, we said, included relief, recovery, and reform. Oh, what was the first and biggest problem that Roosevelt had to deal with as soon as he was inaugurated? Does anyone besides Eric and myself remember? Go ahead. Oh, you must say it. Go ahead. Biggest problem he had to face. Right off the bat. He had to face this problem right off the bat. Right off the bat. First day.
Depression.
Well, yeah, the Depression in general. Yes, go ahead.
Banks.
Banking. Remember all the banks? And what did he do? He declared a bank holiday. Shut all the banks in the country down, for re-examination, passed the Emergency Banking Act, which was the first piece of legislation in what was called the first 100 days. The first 100 days and the first New Deal are synonymous. So the first New Deal and the 100 days are synonymous. They're the same thing. The first New Deal was the 16 major pieces of legislation that were passed in a 100-day session of Congress. Now, you might say, what should I know? Well, I guess you should know the Emergency Banking Act. I guess you should at least know this. What does the AAA have to do with? What sector of the economy does the Agricultural Adjustment Act have to do with? Maybe agriculture, right? That Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, paid farmers to do what? Not to produce, so as to reduce supply. Part of the first New Deal. Tell me one other thing that was part of the first New Deal. Tell me one other thing. Someone else must tell me one other thing. What did he say? The Emergency Relief Act? Yes, go ahead.
Glass-Steagall?
Glass-Steagall. What did Glass-Steagall do? Because I see that on the test. Glass-Steagall, what did that do? How did you know if you didn't know it? Just remember, it sounded interesting. Glass-Steagall. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
It established the FDIC.
Ah, yes, the old FDIC, the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, right, that protected the deposits of people's deposits in banks in case of a bank failure. So the FDIC is something that is still in existence today, but in very, very successful program. Can you name any person besides FDR that was associated with the first New Deal? Any person besides FDR that was associated with the first New Deal? Who say Eleanor Roosevelt, yes. How about Harry Hopkins? What agency was he associated with? Federal Emergency Relief Agency. Eventually, the CWA and the WPA. WPA stands for Works Progress Administration. The Works Progress Administration was the major eventual relief agency of the New Deal. Because this is the agency that's going to employ people for purposes of relief. We're going to give you jobs because you don't have any money, you can't support yourself, the private sector can't employ you, so we're going to hire you. The WPA. And we talked about that at great length. We also talked about the Tennessee Valley Authority and that being very controversial. Why? What was so controversial? Part of the first New Deal, the Tennessee Valley Authority was terribly controversial. Why was that the case? Yes, go ahead.
The government was doing something like private industries.
That's a perfect response. Absolutely. The government was participating in an activity that had been reserved primarily for private industry. And so they called this creeping socialism, the TVA. The second New Deal comes in the aftermath of a significant challenge to Roosevelt from the left. Now, we talked about the challenge from the left, and we said there were three very popular people that emerged to challenge Roosevelt from the left. Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend? Yeah. Francis Townsend. I was going to say Charles Townsend. That's the Townsend Acts, right? Charles Townsend. Francis Townsend, Father Coughlin, and Huey Long. Hey, what was Huey Long's plan called, Lou? What did he want to do? And that's what his plan is called. Go ahead, say it, say it, say it, say it. Say it, say it, say it, say it.
Share our wealth.
Share our wealth. The share our wealth plan. Remember, he wanted to confiscate all the riches of the wealthy and redistribute them to the poor. I know the share our wealth plan, the Tea Party wouldn't like that very well now. Right? You know, that's the the redistribution of wealth. Can you imagine that? I mean, now this is a very controversial issue, the idea of sharing wealth and taxation. I mean, Long had all kinds of support. I guess desperate people kind of say, oh, gee, that's a good idea. We don't have a car, we don't have a house, we don't have any money, rich people have lots. Why don't we take it from them and give it to us? Which is something that attracted a lot of attention. And Long's popularity, as well as Coughlin's popularity, as well as Townsend's popularity, might have resulted in the Second New Deal, which included the Wagner Act. What did the Wagner Act have to do with? The Wagner Act, national... Yes?
Legalize organization of labor unions.
Yes, it made it easier to organize labor unions. It promoted the labor movement. It was called the Wagner or the National Labor Relations Act. It was the piece of legislation that gave unions the legal right to exist. And the Social Security Act is an income redistribution. It might not have been as dramatic as Huey Long's share our wealth, but it also provided for workers paying for people that didn't. And so Social Security was also maybe a response. The Second New Deal was maybe a response to sort of the challenges of these left-wing zealots at the time. Roosevelt responds with the Second New Deal, is easily reelected in 36. But after his reelection in 36, he makes a crucial mistake. He attempts to pack something. Alex, do you recall what he attempted to pack? If I called on Belay, do you think there's any chance he would remember? Belay. Darn you, Belay. Regina, representing the former Soviet Union. I bought a Snickers bar today. Yes. So yes. Yeah, I tried to pack the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had ruled 7 of 9 pieces.
Mr. Santilli, please call 5741. Mr. Santilli, 5741.
Had declared 7 of 9 pieces of New Deal legislation to be unconstitutional. And Roosevelt, in an attempt, thinking that he'd won a sweeping electoral victory, and he had. He'd won 46 of 48 states. The Democrats had stronger majorities in both the House and the Senate. Clearly, it was a mandate for the New Deal. An attempt to fully implement it, he attempts to pack the Supreme Court, which backfires. The idea of seizing that kind of power is reprehensible to a lot of people. And so he attempts to pack the Supreme Court. It backfires on him. And a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans thwart his future efforts at the New Deal. The New Deal ends with the court packing bill. I mean, there may have been one piece of legislation that was passed after that. And then, if you think about it, the New Deal is thwarted by the court packing bill and events that transpire in Europe that distract the attention of the country during World War II. But in the aftermath of World War II, when the economy recovered and Truman was elected in 48, as we discussed, he tried to extend the New Deal with a fair deal. And that doesn't get anywhere. He isn't successful in sort of extending the New Deal. And then when Eisenhower is elected in 52, he has this kind of, what you call dynamic conservatism. That dynamic conservatism of Eisenhower really is just maintaining what had been kind of accomplished with the New Deal. I mean, the linchpin of the New Deal was Social Security, and Eisenhower expands it. In 52. He doesn't retract it. This is the real, Social Security is the real, thing that the conservatives were antagonistic to. This is kind of a redistribution of income and wealth. And, Eisenhower doesn't necessarily attack that. Now, we said the attention of the country was distracted by 37 to things that were happening overseas. One thing that we didn't talk about in class, but was talked about in the book, is Roosevelt's diplomatic policy with Latin America. Does anybody remember what was called? The AP loves to ask questions about diplomacy with Latin America. Does anybody remember what Roosevelt's policy was called, besides the instructor? Yeah, I see that hand down there.
Is it the good neighbor policy?
It is the good neighbor. Who is that? Wow, dear Marissa, it is the good neighbor policy, right? The good neighbor policy it is. You know, and the good neighbor policy was Roosevelt's approach to Latin America. And it was largely in a response to Germany and Italy and Japan. If we're going to have to fight this war, let's make friends with our Latin American neighbors. Let's not have another Zimmerman situation. So, you know, let's end kind of any antagonism between us and Latin America because we might need them. Now, we know in the 1930s, in the mid-1930s, that the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans were aggressive. And we also know what the American response was to that aggressiveness. The American response to that aggressiveness, what country did the Italians invade? The ever kind of dangerous, yes, Ethiopia. Yes, sir. And then, if we wanted to identify a country that Germany kind of absorbed, it would be Austria. Invaded more Czechoslovakia. And, you know, this aggression, the response was a series of laws that were collectively known as neutrality acts that prohibited some of the same things that America had fought for in World War I. One of those being the right for Americans to travel on belligerent vessels. That became illegal under the Neutrality Acts. Now, neutrality became problematic as Japan extended into China, and Hitler moved in Europe, and Italy moved in Europe, and Roosevelt attempts to sort of encourage the American people to accept some kind of action with the quarantine speech that he delivers in July of '37, where he kind of says, well, maybe we might need to do something. The quarantine speech is not well received. Even in '37, Americans are absolutely convinced that they can avoid going to war. That as things got, you know, kind of dicey in Europe, Americans were convinced that all they had to do was sort of shutter themselves in the Western Hemisphere, pass this legislation to prevent making the same mistake twice, and they wouldn't become embroiled in European problems like World War I. Now, in retrospect, this may have been a mistake, and Roosevelt was a little bit ahead of thinking with that. And, you know, certainly, particularly as Germany expanded its influence. You know, Munich, we mentioned Munich today. And Munich, you know, the British and the French agreed to allow the Germans to absorb a part of what country? Do you recall? Who said? Who said? I heard it. Is it you, Marissa?
No, it's Kristen.
Say it. Go ahead, Kristen.
Czechoslovakia.
Czechoslovakia. Yes, it is Czechoslovakia. What part of Czechoslovakia? Because, Kristen, these are your people. There were German-speaking people there. No, it was the Sudetenland, right? The Sudetenland. Right? Give us the Sudetenland and we'll be happy. Remember, we said that was relevant to today, our conversation of today. If we allow the North Koreans to take South Korea. But remember, when we did the Korean War today, we said we didn't really think it was the North Koreans that were initiating that invasion. We thought it was the Russians. So basically, we said if we allow the Russians to take South Korea, will that embolden them to go further? And the pattern of Munich, you know, and the appeasement in Munich was something that people were very conscious of. Even Truman in 1950. And Munich, really the Munich meeting where the Allies allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland was in 1938, a mere 12 years earlier. Now, after Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Stalin, what country does he invade that starts officially World War II? Poland. He signs a non-aggression pact with Poland, or with Russia, and invades Poland. When he does so, England and France come to Poland's aid, and World War II is on. Now, once the invasion of Poland occurs, the debate in the United States is, what are we going to do? Now, the answer is never intervene. So, you know, nobody is really saying intervene. But what should our stance on neutrality be? And basically, what Roosevelt pushes the country toward is kind of a non-belligerent support of the Allies. In other words, we're not going to get into war, but we are going to do anything short of war to assist the Allies. And that really becomes the, yeah, go ahead.
Is that like the Lend-Lease?
Yeah, that, well, before Lend-Lease, what's Roosevelt's first attempt to get Americans to support a non-neutral kind of extension of aid to the Allies?
Cash and carry.
Yeah, well, cash and carry, good. To adjust the Neutrality Acts to include cash and carry. And then in September of 40, of course, we had destroyers' bases. And then, where Roosevelt sent some, old destroyers to the British in return for leases on military bases in the Caribbean. And then Roosevelt runs for re-election in 40. He's re-elected to an unprecedented third time. And then in 41, he proposes to Congress Lend-Lease. And that generates a congressional debate. Because to support Lend-Lease in 41, January of 41 proposed, I think it was passed in March or April, would basically be not neutral anymore. Because Lend-Lease was a veiled way of overtly supplying to the British, and eventually Lend-Lease was extended to the Russians. Because remember, Hitler attacks Russia in June of 41. But I should say this, the most kind of significant event of World War II for the United States initially was the fall of France. I mean, not that you need to know all the dates, but you kind of need to know the order of things. You kind of need to know, the fall of France came before the invasion of Russia. That, the fall, I mean, really the order of things is France falls, the Battle of Britain, the invasion of Russia. Those are things that are kind of happening before the United States enters into the war. The United States doesn't enter into the war until after the fall of France, until after the invasion of Russia. But we are supporting the British and eventually the Russians with Lend-Lease. Now, in the fall of 41, the United States is absolutely, positively brinked to go to war with the Germans. But we end up going to war with Japan. Now, the reason we go to war with Japan is because Roosevelt insisted on something. What did he insist the Japanese do? Yeah, go ahead, Rose.
Get out of China?
Get out of China. It is something the Japanese refuse to do. And so a sequence of events occurs that eventually leads to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We went through that. But fundamentally, the Japanese had a choice. The choice was either get out of China or fight the United States. If they were going to fight the United States, they were going to attack first. And so they planned the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. And remember, when they planned the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, their intention was to create a circumstance where not they would defeat the United States, but able to extract from the United States a peace that would be favorable to them. And they were even trying to do that up until the very end. Up until the very end of World War II, the Japanese were trying to extract a peace from the United States that would be favorable to them. That's why they resisted with such tenacity. That's why they did the things that they did. They did not expect to be able to win. At some point, it became hopeless. Oh, incidentally, what was the most important naval battle of the Pacific? We said turn the tide. Go ahead, Worms. This is your life.
Midway?
Midway. That was in June of 42. Once the war started, there is a lengthy discussion in your textbook, which I'm sure you have not read, but if you did, about the domestic economy. And one of the things that really the AP likes to talk about is the way the Japanese were treated in the United States. The only group that was kind of, I shouldn't say the only group, but the main group that was singled out for kind of suspicion in the aftermath of the bombing of Pearl Harbor were Japanese Americans. Mostly on the West Coast and Hawaii. Here were Japanese Americans that loyalty were questioned. And the big thing is that Roosevelt participated in incarcerating these people. That dozens, hundreds, thousands of Japanese Americans were put into concentration camps during World War II. Internment camps. Internment camps. They were interned. Now, The Japanese Americans were not treated like Jews or other people that were put in concentration camps in Europe. But they still lost their freedom, in some cases their property and other things. And the way that Japanese Americans were treated, some of them who were American citizens, others who were not, is to some extent an embarrassment to the United States. So there's a little discussion of that, and I would take a look at that. Now, during the war, we said the big question during the war, well, a couple of questions. One question is, where are we going to go first? And the answer is Europe. Europe first, then Asia. In Europe, what are we going to do? Open a second front in France or not? Rather than open a second front in 42, what does Roosevelt and Churchill decide to do in 43? Yes. Invade Italy, right? Which is kind of a second front. It eventually takes until June of 44 for the final cross-channel invasion to occur, which we call the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord. Now that's in June of 44, and it takes till April of 45 for the Russians and the Americans to converge in Germany and to defeat the Germans unconditionally. Now, there are a few questions on the test about the big wartime conferences. The big wartime conferences are Casablanca. At Casablanca, we decide to invade Italy. Tehran, that's when we decide the D-Day invasion. Yalta, that's in February of 45, where we're having these discussions in Yalta about the post-war world and what's going to happen to Eastern Europe. And remember, at Yalta, Stalin promised to have free and fair elections in Poland and the Eastern European countries, which he does not do. And so that's when we say, well, wait a minute. You know, Stalin, what are you doing here? You said you'd have free and fair elections there, but you're not. And remember, we talked about this is, you know, Eastern Europe is a big venue for kind of the Cold War, right? And we also, of course, talked about the D-Day invasion that actually occurs. Eisenhower, how he led that. We elected in 4th and 6th period, we elected Eisenhower. Remember, you missed so much in 3rd period. We elected Eisenhower into the presidency today, and we said that his D-Day invasion makes him a national hero that eventually catapults him to the presidency in 52. You know, Eisenhower was so squeaky clean. You know, this will go on YouTube. You know, he had a girlfriend the whole time. He was married the whole time over in Europe. He had a girlfriend. So he was married to Mamie Eisenhower, which you would think that if your name is like Dwight D. Eisenhower, your wife's name would naturally be Mamie. You know, and they seemed like that grandfatherly couple, but later on, so no one's perfect, I suppose. Well, Eisenhower, you know, is the leader of the D-Day invasion, and the D-Day invasion, you know, pushes right to Germany. What's the counterattack that Hitler launches? His last counterattack? Does anybody recall? Yes. Battle of the Bulge. I could ask you what Belgium city they were trying to take. Sean Whelan and say Antwerp. You know, or Worms or Doyle that likes World War II. The end of World War II, you know, we talked about Asia, island hopping, unconditional surrender. There is a question on the test about demanding unconditional surrender, both from the Japanese and from the Germans, which would result in total destruction of both societies. You know, and in the case of the Japanese, the deployment of nuclear weapons. What was the project called? That was, yes, Manhattan Project. Started in 42. It was Albert Einstein who, you know, tips Roosevelt off that, look, the Germans are working on this. Einstein, a German Jew, says, look, they're working on this. And so you better do this. And Roosevelt goes secretly to Congress and they fund $2 billion to work secretly on this project. It comes to fruition in the Los Alamos Desert in July of 45. Now remember, it is at Potsdam, which is in Germany, where Truman gets the news of a successful detonation. And that's the first time he lets Stalin know about it. So in terms of the Cold War, hey, you got this weapon, you're our ally, how can you tell us about it? You know? And so, you know, the eventual invasion or the eventual deployment of nuclear weapons in Japan is really controversial, but does end the war. You know, and the war is over. That puts us in the position of, you know, being, as Churchill said, the preeminent power in the world. You know, and so then after we ended World War II, we kind of went into this post-war era. And we said what defined it was an economic phenomenon, a boom, the post-war boom, and a demographic phenomenon, a movement. The movement had elements to it. The economic phenomenon was the post-World War II economic boom that was fueled by pent-up demand, cheap energy prices, you know, increased productivity, and a number of other reasons. The demographic boom was the baby boom. The growth of, you know, all these babies that were born, you know, the idea of searching for security, and a part of that demographic move was the movement to the suburbs. You know, the economic boom and the demographic boom, the movement to the suburbs, these things are all connected. And eventually, central to that, you know, the real core of the post-war era is the 1950s. I mean, the 1950s is the golden time of the post-war era. That's when Ike is in the White House, people are in the suburbs, they're having children, the economy is booming, times are good, but we're still afraid of the Russians. Right? Regina, we're still afraid of the Russians. And that became our eventual discussion. You know, we talked briefly about the demographic things that were happening, but we got into the Cold War, and we talked about, and we're almost done, patience, just another moment or two. We're almost done. We talked about the Cold War, and we said that the fundamental thing that starts the Cold War has to do over a difference in security. Both the Soviets and the Americans were looking for security. We look for security in a powerful United Nations. They look for security in a sphere of influence. What part of Europe did they seek to dominate? Do you remember? Anyone besides the instructor? Loretta? No. Yes. Doyle? Not Western Europe. Eastern Europe. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. These are all Eastern European countries, not Western European countries, Eastern European countries. Right? And what did the Russians do there? They installed governments, which they thought that Roosevelt understood from Yeltsin. And they saw as kind of a way to protect their interests. We didn't kind of think they needed that. And we didn't kind of think that we had agreed to that. And so this generates this mutual, you know, distrust that's exacerbated by other things, you know, the Marshall Plan, and eventually the Truman Doctrine. Oh, I should mention before this, you know, we asked the question, what's the Soviets up to? Who answered that question for America? Who answered the question, what are the Soviets up to? Say. Kennan. George Kennan. George Kennan answers that question. And what is his response? One word. Kennan's response to what are the Soviets up to? Well, I mean, maybe not this. The policy that comes out of his response is one word. Containment. The Soviets are expansionistic. They'll attempt to extend their influence anywhere they can. And we should do our best to contain them. Because if they meet resistance, they'll back up. That's why we did what we did in Korea. You know, why did we do this? Because this is what the Soviets do. Now remember, we said in retrospect, it really wasn't fully the Soviets' idea to invade Korea. It was more the Koreans' idea. But containment was the policy which was put into practice with the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was in reference to Greece and Turkey, and it suggested that the United States would defend free institutions wherever people were fighting. And it should be our responsibility to do so. Now remember we said this, that look, the Truman Doctrine represented a dramatic departure in the role of the United States in the world. Now we are intervening in everything. We are going to defend freedom and democracy in the world, rather than shuttering ourselves in isolation. So this was a big deal. Maybe even the real embodiment of that is America's entrance into NATO, which we said was April of '49, where we get into an entangling alliance. Now, and we're really close to wrapping it up now. We said after the NATO alliance, the stalemate in Europe lasted really until the 1990s. And the focus was on Asia, and China, Korea, and Vietnam. I mean, those are the areas of Asia where containment is put into place. We lose China, and when we lose China at 49, the Republicans blame the Democrats on that, and they vow never to do it again. We'll never lose anything again. And so the Democrats are always apologizing for losing China, even though they maintain it wasn't theirs to lose. So, does that contribute to Truman, sort of responding to the North Koreans? We're certainly going to make the argument that it contributes to what happens in Vietnam. Truman is elected in 48, and to great surprise of the country, because the Democratic Party is divided between the progressives and the Dixiecrats. Who was the Dixiecrat candidate?
Strom Thurmond.
Perfect, Strom Thurmond. And then the last question, NCS 68 call for what?
Triple
Increase
budget.
military expenditures. Okay, it's a little bit longer than usual, but you kids are a little bit smarter.